Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of the discussion about the future of the global maritime industry. I hope you all had a good rest. I hope you all had a good night last night. And those of you who've just been at the breakfast talking about the Poseidon principles, I hope you thrashed out some more interesting work on that front. That's a very interesting example of the collaboration that's coming out of the industry coming together and taking practical measures to push forward change. I must say, I found yesterday's discussion fascinating, even, or perhaps especially, though I'm not an expert in the maritime industry at all. And listening to you talk, I know we tossed quite a few Chinese proverbs around yesterday, but listening to you talk yesterday, it really occurred to me that the truth in that old Chinese proverb that the characters for crisis can also mean opportunity is very true for where the maritime sector is today. You're not facing a crisis, but you have had quite a jolt, quite a shock in terms of the explosion of protectionist language, populist language, patriotic or nationalist language that's come up and is making people talk about trade and think about the future of trade with much more urgency than they have for many years. And it occurs to me that this, in some ways, really is an opportunity for the maritime industry to come out and remind everyone why you exist, the crucial linchpin that you play in the global economy in terms of moving things around. And out of that jolt, out of that shock, there's also a chance to talk about a number of issues that have been building up in recent years to do with the environment, to do with digitization, which need, in many ways, accelerated discussion, debate, and solutions. And just looking at the range of discussions and the range of ideas that have been put up on those boards yesterday to do with decarbonization, to do with other environmental measures, to do with looking at AI, looking at technology, cybersecurity, all of those issues shows the level of discussion that's going on. And they also underscore another point that came out very clearly from the discussion yesterday, which is that although shipping has traditionally been an incredibly fragmented, in many ways quite opaque industry, the buzzword now very much is collaboration, trying to find shared solutions, trying to share information, and also looking for ways to be more transparent, not just to the outside world, but also inside the sector as you grope towards solutions on the environment, on the potential for digital technologies to unleash new efficiencies and to deal with threats like cybersecurity. So I must say, as someone who trained as a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist, someone who's trained to go around looking at tribes, a bit like yourself, the maritime tribe is in a very interesting moment of flux right now. And that's a great point to say two things. Firstly, that today is really going to be a continuation of the journey that you were on yesterday. You will be going back in about an hour's time into the groups that you were with late yesterday afternoon, looking at your specialized topic. There are a lot of different topics, and they were all up on the board. I hope you all know which section you're in. You will be going back after the talk to continue that discussion and try and put up some more proactive, practical solutions to some of the questions you raised yesterday. And we will then be reconvening later on to share some of the learnings and proposals you have. But before we do that, we have a fantastic speaker to really wake up your brains and kick off the discussion for today, who's going to be talking about one of the key issues that came out yesterday, which is disruption, digital technologies, and innovation. And in particular, he's going to be looking at something that all of you need to know about, which is, where do good ideas come from? Where do people get that flash of inspiration, that moment of genius, which can transform a company, transform an individual, and transform a sector? I'm not going to give away his secrets, except to say that insofar as collaboration has been one of the key themes of the discussion so far, it very much plays into what you're going to hear about. Because the idea of having a lone genius sitting somewhere off on a little island by themselves, living a crazy mad life, and suddenly waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning with a brilliant innovation or invention, that certainly makes good stories, it makes great Hollywood movies, it makes for great newspaper articles. It's not actually how many of the great ideas come about in the real world. So Steve Johnson has flown over from Boston. He literally landed just a few hours ago to come and talk to you. He is an author of 9 books. I'm in awe of 9 books. He has trained originally in media studies, English, but he's been looking at science and technology and innovation for much of his career. His latest book is called Farsighted: How We Make the Decisions That Matter the Most. A very good subtitle, which affects all of us. And it's just had a glowing review. It literally came hot off the presses a couple of weeks ago. It's had a glowing review from the New York Times, who said, quotes, "Riveting. As a deep thinker and gifted storyteller, Johnson is the right author to tackle the topic. He's at his best when analyzing impossibly complex decisions." Well, impossibly complex decisions are something that many of you face. So over to you, Steve, to hear or present the ways to think about innovation and how to solve those impossibly complex problems.
Thank you, Joy. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for that. Yeah, I literally just arrived here. I am in the middle of a book tour for Farsighted, and you can imagine my publisher, when they're having me travel around. I was doing a talk in Boston last night, and I was like, I must, in between book tour events, go to Hong Kong. But this event was so unique that it seemed like it was an opportunity that I really had to take. So I'm honored to be here. This is a really special organization. It seems like the cause is important. And it seems like the initial conversations that I missed yesterday, but that I have kind of filled in myself on by looking at the whiteboards over there, were really interesting. And I learned a lot just from kind of surveying what's happened. As Gillian said, I've written a number of books. They've been on a lot of different topics, in the sense that one of them was about a cholera epidemic in London in the 1850s, and one of them was about an 18th century chemist, and one was about modern neuroscience, and I've written about tech in Silicon Valley. So it's been a really diverse range of subject matter. But what has united all of those different books, and what runs through this new book, Farsighted, as well, is a recurring interest in this question, as Gillian put it, of new ideas and where they come from and what drive them. Ideas that truly change the world, truly, as we say, disruptive ideas. What are the patterns and the places and the habits, and what kinds of organizations lead to truly breakthrough ideas? And what I've tried to do in my work across all the books is to look at unusually innovative teams, cultures, cities, people, in lots of different disciplines, in lots of different fields, at lots of different moments of time, and to discern in all of that information recurring patterns that can teach us a little bit about being more innovative in our own organizations and our own industries. What's so special, I think, about this gathering in terms of my current work is that Farsighted is also looking at this question of long-term decision-making and really complex, challenging problems. And so the mix of innovation and long-term thinking is really at the heart of the kinds of problems that you all are wrestling with here, that this organization is trying to tackle. And so I'm delighted to be here to share some of what I've learned over the years in looking at these topics. I wanted to start with a space, because one of the things that I think is really fascinating is, like, what are the both physical or virtual spaces? What kinds of environments lead to breakthrough ideas, right? It's not the lone genius on an island or alone in a lab somewhere, as much as we like that mythology. It is almost always a space of collaboration, where people are coming together in some form and sharing ideas and building on each other's ideas. And over the course of my work, I've looked at a number of these spaces, but my favorite one, really, of all time, in fact, it's such a favorite of mine that I keep habitually writing about it in book after book after book. For a while I had a little post-it note over my desk saying no more writing about this, but I can't stop myself. But it's particularly relevant to this group, and that space is the 18th century coffee house. If you try and ask yourself, where did the Enlightenment happen? Where did that great kind of flowering of intellectual and economic and scientific and political ideas really where were its roots, the physical space that conjured up that explosion of ideas? You would be wrong to point to a university department or a corporate headquarters. It was really the coffee house, particularly in London, but in other places as well, across Europe and in the United States, where people would gather together, drink coffee and tea, sometimes for the first time. Coffee and tea had come to London around 1660 for the first time. People went insane for it. In fact, coffee houses became so popular that briefly Charles II actually banned coffee houses because he felt that people were wasting their time there. He felt that coffee houses were distracting men from their lawful calling and affairs, as he put it, and he actually decreed that coffee houses should be shut down, a ban which lasted exactly 1 week because everyone was already so hooked on coffee and tea that they refused to put up with it. And Charles II was actually dead wrong. What looked like a space where people were escaping from work and not going to church or not hanging out with their families turned out to be an incredibly generative space. And almost every important idea in politics and science and business during that period has a coffee house in its story somewhere. I once wrote a book years ago called The Invention of Air about Joseph Priestley, the 18th century political radical and chemist and scientist and polymath, who was great friends with Benjamin Franklin when Ben Franklin was living in London. And they used to hang out at this coffee house called the London Coffee House. And they had this extraordinary scene there where they would talk about chemistry and politics and the publishing business, and all these different ideas came out of that coffee house culture. And when I was researching the book, I went back to London to see if there was a plaque commemorating where this coffee house was, because as you know, there's like a plaque on every other building in London commemorating something from history. And I thought, this is one of the key places. It was the birth of the modern world, really. It comes out of coffee house culture. These spaces should be, part of the tour guide, history of London. And I tracked down where it was, right by St. Paul's Cathedral. And there was no record of it at all, but I swear to you, there is a Starbucks exactly where this coffee house was. So they have no idea, but everybody in there is keeping the torch alive for this historic coffee house from the past. But I really wanted to start with this because, as I'm sure many of you know, and I'm sure there's some people from this organization, the connection here is that in the 1680s, a young coffee house entrepreneur named Edward Lloyd opened up a coffee house called Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street in London. And that became a hub where the local merchant community, the investment community, ship captains, and people in the kind of maritime trade at the time would gather, drink coffee, share ideas. And Lloyd was kind of famous for giving information about the shipping business so that they could keep track of new ships that were going out, new deals, new information about shipwrecks and things like that. And through that casual, informal coffee house setting and those conversations, the kind of convergence of those different ideas and interests, with the addition of some new interesting mathematical breakthroughs in probability theory and things like that, from that conversation, a new idea about insurance began to develop and how we could take this incredibly risky practice of sending ships all around the world and bringing back spices and calico and all the things that were making money for companies like the East India Company at that point, how they could take that incredibly risky practice and take some of the risk out of it using these new insurance models. And that, of course, became Lloyd's of London, the first modern insurance company. So the roots of the modern shipping business, of modern maritime industry, are also embedded in a coffee house in London in the 1680s. And these kinds of spaces recur again and again throughout history. They're hubs of ideas. They're places where people come together without a clear mission, without a clear point. They're there to share ideas and to commune and to have open-ended conversations. And in a way, it's a model for what this gathering is all about, right? We're trying to bring a bunch of people who have some shared interests, but have open-ended conversations where new solutions can potentially become visible. In my book, Where Good Ideas Come From, I call these environments liquid networks. They're environments where there's a certain fluidity of idea exchange that happens. If you think of it in a physics metaphor, it's that middle ground between too much stability of a solid and too much chaos of a gas, that middle ground of liquid water where, not coincidentally, life first evolved in the first place. Ideas can bounce off each other, but it's not so chaotic that they disappear immediately after they make an interesting new connection, and it's not so stable that nothing ever changes. The coffee house was a liquid network. This, ideally, it seems like, just from looking at the whiteboards, is a liquid network. And that experience, I mean, this is a term, the kind of liquid metaphor is something that economists actually use to explain one of the interesting kind of riddles of history, which is why urban areas historically have been so disproportionately more per capita innovative than less settled areas, right? It should be so distracting to have all these people around and all the chaos and everything. It should, if having a good idea was about sitting quietly in a room and thinking up a big thought, you would think that cities would be the worst place to have an idea. But in fact, cities are huge and historically have always been massive drivers of innovation. And it's because, one of the reasons is because, as economists say, again using this liquid metaphor, this property of information spillover, where ideas, when you crowd people together, spill over from mind to mind, and someone working on one part of a problem stumbles across another friend who's working on another part of the problem, and through that kind of casual conversation, a solution becomes visible that wasn't visible when the two were just working on their own. So thinking about that, thinking about this kind of organization, thinking about these kinds of spaces in your own workspace, right? What is the liquid network in your own office? Right? One of the things that I see a lot as I go around talking to companies is what I sometimes call the kind of the war on conference rooms, right? Where people have decided in organizations that conference rooms are where ideas go to die, right? Somebody schedules a 3 o'clock meeting, 10 people show up, somebody puts up a PowerPoint, and everybody kind of shuts off their brain, right? That is not a space of great innovation and collaboration. Whereas a lot of times what I'm seeing people doing is they're taking out a bank of conference rooms and they're opening up a open-ended meeting space that has coffee, that often is kind of curated with interesting things to stimulate new ideas and kind of serendipitous discoveries, and where multiple meetings are going on at the same time. So there's an opportunity for interesting new connections and links to form that you won't get in that 3 o'clock meeting in the conference room. In Farsighted, in this new book, I've turned to the related question of complex decisions. When we are facing, this is the opposite of kind of books like Blink, or those of you who read Thinking Fast and Slow, which focus on kind of gut decisions, instinctive decisions. There's fascinating research on that, fascinating brain science, but the kinds of choices that you all are wrestling with, the kinds of choices that are visible on those whiteboards out there, are the opposite of that. They're decisions that I call in Farsighted full spectrum decisions. And they involve a whole range of different disciplines, a whole range of different phenomena, different scales of experience. When you think about the maritime ecosystem that's mapped out there, when you're wrestling with issues of economies and trade deals and global warming, new technological developments, it requires a huge range of values and forms of expertise that have to converge on a problem. Those are the toughest choices in life. And I've come to think that we are not suitably trained to make decisions like this. One of the things I start Farsighted with is an anecdote about Darwin in the 1830s, right, when Darwin was coming up with the theory of natural selection. And in his notebooks at the time, he's furiously writing all these things about evolution as this idea. It's a fascinating, if you've ever read any of these notebooks from this period, they're fascinating because you can see arguably the most important idea of the 19th century kind of taking shape in Darwin's mind and on the pages of his notebook. But in the middle of this process, he pauses and actually, right in the middle of all this scientific kind of thinking, he stops and starts weighing another kind of idea, another kind of decision that he's wrestling with, which is, should I get married? And he actually, in the middle of his scientific journals, he creates a pros and cons list for getting married. He divides it up and says, not marry, marry, and writes down all the attributes for each one. And it hasn't aged very well. I reproduced it in Farsighted if you get a chance to look at it. It's on the side of not marry. One of the things he feels like he would give up if he gets married is conversation of clever men in clubs, which I guess is the coffee house scene that he would miss. But in the end, he does decide to marry. And what I find so fascinating about this is that the pros and cons list for a complex decision, whether it's to get married or an important business decision or an industry-wide decision, the pros and cons list is one of the few things that people are actually taught, right, outside of business school. An ordinary person might learn a pros and cons list, but that's it. And there you have Darwin doing that 200 years ago. So in a sense, the technology and the techniques of making complex decisions, of coming up with original solutions to the problems that we face, is actually, in many ways, been stagnant for a long time. And so with Farsighted, I went out to try and explore some of the new developments in that field, because there is actually an amazing body of research into complex decision making and how we do it. And a lot of it overlaps, as we'll see, with the innovation research. That a lot of the techniques that we have to use in solving a complex problem and making a complex decision connect with the kinds of techniques we have to use in being creative or innovative in our work. The most important thing is to think of the decision-making process as a process. And to not just think of it as we're going to have a bunch of conversations and we're going to mull this and to think about it in the shower, but to actually divide it up into a set of stages. And there are varying kind of approaches for what those stages should be. In Farsighted, I divided up into a mapping stage, a predicting stage, and a decision-making stage, a deciding stage. And interestingly, it's great to see there's kind of mapping is showing up here and predicting is showing up in theme. So you're working through these frameworks already in the first day of this session. One expert in this field is a now retired professor, kind of management theory professor named Paul Nutt, Professor Nutt, who in the 80s and 90s did a series of studies of actual business decisions that have been made, looking at the process, or lack thereof, behind those decisions. How do people make an important, should they launch this new product? Should they close down this factory? Should they open up this new wing? And he analyzed the way the decision was made, and then he went back 2 or 3 years later and interviewed the folks and tried to figure out if the decision was considered to be a success. And he tried to look at the kind of patterns of decision making in all these case studies. He looked at hundreds and hundreds of decisions. And probably the most important finding that he had is that it was very unusual. Only about 20% of the decisions involved a deliberate stage where the decision makers sought out other options. Almost all the decisions took the form of what Nutt called a whether or not decision. So it was like, should we do this or not? And there was debate about whether or not we should do it, but there was never a time where people said, hey, before we actually have that debate, let's look at the whole field here and see if there are other potential solutions that are available to us. And let's have this stage, it's sometimes in the innovation language, it's sometimes called a divergence stage, right, as opposed to a convergence stage, right? The divergence stage is where you're trying to come up with lots of different ideas. You're trying to be as creative as possible. You're trying to come up with other alternatives that you can think about in making this momentous decision. Later on, you'll have the convergence stage where you actually try and come up with the right path, where you're narrowing down your options. But to spend time with that open-ended exploration of other options is really important. Nutt found that folks who did not include that phase, less than 30% of the time were they actually happy in the end with the choice that they'd made. Whereas folks that did include that phase, where they explored and uncovered other options, were more than 50% likely to actually feel good about their decision in the long run, even if they ended up going with their original choice. And so breaking out that in that mapping stage where you're trying to figure out what all the variables are and what all the different options are is really important. There's a great example of this. In Farsighted, I have a lot of examples from urban planning, which is an interesting field where a lot of the techniques that we're doing here, where we're talking about kind of bringing together different stakeholders, we're talking about exploring all the different variables, using techniques like design charrettes and things like that, thinking about sustainability. Urban planning has been doing that for a long time, and so it's a field that one can learn from in many ways. In this case, one example of diversifying your options, this is an elevated railway line in New York City that used to run along the Hudson back when the west side of Manhattan was had an active shipping yard and a lot of industry. And by 1980, all of that had gone away. The docks were abandoned, actually. They're now parks. And there was no longer a need for an industrial elevated rail line running along the west side of Manhattan. And so in 1980, the last kind of forlorn car carrying like 3 boxes of turkeys, apparently, went up the rail line, and then it went dormant. And it stayed dormant for about 25 years. It was just an eyesore, overrun with weeds and graffiti. It was a place where kids would go up and drink beer. And for 20 years, there was a decision that the city of New York faced, which was a classic whether or not decision, which is, should we tear it down or not? Because obviously it has no purpose. And the only other question was, who should pay for it if we do tear it down? But then starting around 15 years ago, a movement began to develop involving people, crucially, who were not part of the official decision-making process at all. One was an artist, one was a photographer, one was a writer. They were in the community, and they'd seen what it looked like up on these abandoned rail yards. It gave you this interesting vantage point on the city, and there was kind of a beauty in the wild grasses that would grow there in the summer. And so they began to make an argument that, in fact, there was another option. It wasn't a whether or not decision. It was a which one decision. It was a, we could tear it down, yes, but what if we did something else? What if we turned it into a park? And that became the Highline Park. I'm sure a bunch of you have been there. Certainly one of the most celebrated urban parks in the last 20 years. It's an amazing experience. Now extends about 20, 25 blocks up the west side. Thriving, almost too crowded now because it's so successful. Classic destructive success phenomena. But it came out of outside voices bringing in a new proposal, a new solution, a new way of thinking about the problem that they invented, that the authorities or the insiders weren't able to come up with on their own. And then with any kind of choice like this, you're inevitably then pushed into a second phase, which is either implicit or something that you actively think about as a phase, as a part of the decision process, which is the predictive phase. And that's what, again, you see there, there's a vision of the world in 2050 that's over there. Any kind of complex decision that you're wrestling with is implicitly a prediction about the future on some level, right? You're trying to decide whether it's a personal decision of Darwin trying to decide whether to get married, or whether it's a global decision about how we can come up with sustainable practices that will be good for reducing climate change in the maritime industries. Whatever the decision, it is implicitly a prediction about the future. I think if I do this in 5 years, in 10 years, or 30 years, things will be better if I follow this path. So one of the things that I wanted to wrestle with then in thinking about this is, how good are we at making predictions? And how can we get better? And for this, the canonical study is a fascinating series of studies actually done by a guy named Philip Tett, who wrote a book in 2005 called Expert Political Judgment. And what Tett did is he went around and interviewed hundreds of experts in various different fields, people who wrote op-eds for the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the New York Times, people who went on television and opined about the financial markets or broader economic trends or geopolitical instabilities and so on. And he asked them to make forecasts about the future. What was going to happen in 2 or 5 years in their field, right? In their specialty. And then he had the audacity to go back and actually check up on the results from their forecasts in 2 or 5 years. And what he found was that the experts were almost inevitably terrible at predicting the future. They were worse than chance. They were worse than the proverbial dart-throwing chimp. Simple algorithms that basically would be like, things will stay the same, or current trends will continue in the same direction, dramatically outperformed the experts. And in fact, he found maybe not surprisingly, an inverse correlation between fame and celebrity and accuracy of prediction. So the more famous you were, the more better known you were, the less likely you were to know anything about the future. So that was depressing. But what he did find in that investigation is that there was a subset of these forecasters that actually were better than chance. They weren't perfect. No one is perfect at predicting complex events. But what they were able to do is to see trends that the alleged experts, particularly the famous ones, couldn't see. And so Tett tried to figure out what was it about their approach that made them better at predicting. And he ultimately realized that what differentiated them were two big things that are related, one of which is the successful forecasters, which he later called super forecasters, were not in the kind of service of a single monolithic theory of how the world works. They were much more eclectic in their belief systems. They didn't have a macro narrative that they referred to in all of their forecasts. And they were much more kind of diverse in their interests. They were kind of constant. They were hobbyists and interested in lots of different things. They didn't have a single kind of field of expertise. In psychological tests, they scored very highly on the kind of main psychological axis that's sometimes called openness to experience, which is really another word for curiosity. They were just interested in lots of things, and they weren't kind of in the thrall of like a single monolithic way of looking at the world. And so that eclecticism made them open to kind of new ideas. It made them really look at the data with fresh eyes. It didn't keep them kind of locked down in a single way of interpreting things, but it made them more kind of nimble forecasters. So that's one thing to think about. It's one thing to think about in terms of the forecasts that we're making here. Are we open to those surprising twists that will inevitably happen in the future? Are we too locked down in a single way of looking at the future? But the other area in which we've gotten much better at making predictions that I looked at quite a bit in Farsighted is predicting the weather, particularly kind of 10-day forecasts. I know we're very bad at predicting the weather beyond 10 days, but over the last 20 years, we've gotten much, much better at predicting the weather. Hurricane forecasts are much more accurate than they were 30 years ago. I'm sure we would all like them to be more accurate, but there's been a big advance there. And the main reason that we've gotten so much better in the 10-day kind of scale is the same reason we're able to make, we think, pretty accurate predictions on the 50-year scale for climate change, which is that we now have these supercomputers that can run what they call ensemble simulations of the Earth's atmosphere. And so because you have this incredibly complex system with all these different variables, you can't know it entirely down to the precise level of each water molecule or each little unit of pressure. But you can get a general map of it. And in these ensemble simulations, the way it works is that you kind of simulate the current state of the environment. You make small changes to some of those variables. You run a simulation in the next 10 days, and then you do it again, making some other small adjustments. You run it again for the next 10 days, and you do that 1,000 times or 10,000 times or 50,000 times. And when you look at the overall behavior of the model, you start to see probabilities. Oh, it seems like the hurricane, this is Hurricane Florence, seems to veer towards the Carolinas 80% of the time if we run all these simulations. And so by being able to do these multiple simulations, we're able to not know the future with certainty, but we're able to have a better sense of probability here. So the question is, we don't have ensemble simulations for big decisions in our life like getting married or for big decisions in the corporate world. It's hard to do this. But in a sense, what we do have is storytelling. And that is one of the things that stories do best, is they now enable us to run these imaginary simulations of what might come. That's what we're doing here, right? We're imagining there's a story about the success of 2030. There's a story about where the world is going in 2050, right? We're building these kind of narrative models in our heads. And there's some specific exercises that we can do when we're trying to make innovative and creative decisions, to see things that we wouldn't otherwise see in using this kind of storytelling technique. And one of my favorites is a technique that was developed by the psychologist Gary Klein. And he calls it the pre-mortem. And this is a kind of narrative exercise, a kind of simulation exercise that you do right as you are about to pull the trigger on a decision. You've looked at all the variables, you've come up with all the options, and you've decided that this is the path you're going to take. Klein advises you to do this group exercise where you sit down at the table and you run a pre-mortem. Now, a pre-mortem is, as you can imagine, it's the opposite of a post-mortem. Post-mortem is the patient has died, and it's your job to figure out, what killed the patient. A pre-mortem is the patient will die, and it's your job to tell the story of how the patient dies, i.e., this decision, this path that you're about to march down, imagine it's 2 years from now or 5 years from now, and this decision that we were all excited about turns out to be a catastrophic failure. Tell the story of how it went wrong. And what Klein found in his research is that if you actually force people to do that, instead of just saying, hey, here's our plan, do you see any flaws? When you ask them that way, they say, no, it looks great, I'm totally into this. You get groupthink and confirmation bias and overconfidence and all the failings that groups have when they get together and get united about a choice. But when you actually force them to tell the story of how it goes wrong, they perceive flaws that were not there in the first place, or that they didn't perceive originally. Their mind is kind of open to new possible failure points because they've had to go through this storytelling exercise. And one of the great examples of this kind of long-term thinking is in the raid that led to the capture and death of Osama bin Laden, which was a brilliantly orchestrated decision process, a 9-month decision process where they used a lot of these techniques to come up with original and creative solutions to the problem that they were facing and trying to understand who this mysterious person was and then what to do about it. One of the things that they did near the end, when they had decided emphatically that they were going to send a couple of helicopters in through Pakistani airspace and not tell the Pakistanis, they ran an exercise saying, well, if we do this, how could this go wrong? Imagine the scenario where this goes wrong. Tell that story. And of course, some of that involved the helicopters potentially crashing, which they in fact did. One of them was lost, and they had anticipated that. But also, they came up with the idea that perhaps the Pakistanis will be offended by the fact that we have done this raid without telling them through their airspace, and they will kick us out of Pakistan, which they were using as the primary way of getting all the gear and supplies for the war in Afghanistan. Pakistan was their primary way into Afghanistan. And so because they ran that exercise 2 months before the raid on bin Laden's compound, they greatly expanded what was called the Northern Distribution Network, which was a route, as you can see, kind of through Russia and around into Afghanistan through another way, precisely because they were thinking multiple steps ahead and had done the exercise for imagining what could go wrong. And by the way, I think the pre-mortem is incumbent on every industry that is trying to be disruptive, right? The pre-mortem is exactly what Facebook didn't do, right? They never had that session where they said, well, we're going to connect the world. What could go wrong? They never actually said, what could go wrong? How could this new technology of social media be abused or manipulated or activate kind of regions of kind of dissent that we can't initially imagine? So that exercise of imagining how it can go wrong and of running that pre-mortem is really important. And one other technique, and there are many more that we could talk about, but this is just a little sample of them, is related to the pre-mortem, which is this comes out of Google actually. This is something from their patent filing for their self-driving car. This was the patent filing that announced that Google was working on autonomous driving. And in that patent filing, it included this one really interesting little snippet, which they called the bad events table. And the bad events table is a description of what the algorithm is thinking about as it's driving around the streets of Silicon Valley, analyzing all the different things that could go wrong at that particular moment. And it does two crucial things, which is it generates this bad events table, and for each potential bad event, there's getting hit by a large truck, there's getting hit by an incoming vehicle, there's losing information that is provided by the camera in the current position, and so on. It does two things. It rates each bad event in terms of risk magnitude, i.e. how bad is it, right? Getting hit by a large truck is very, very bad. Losing a sensor is not really that bad at all. And then it also looks at risk probability. And so it's constantly making these evaluations in terms of trying to decide what to do based on there's a very small chance I might get hit by that giant truck, but that still means that I should probably avoid that and lose this sensor by swerving off to the right and digging this car on the right. And so thinking about actually working through the exercise of running bad events tables and thinking about those downstream negative consequences and their probabilities is an exercise, particularly in a group, that we tend to not do when we get all excited about a future new technology or a new platform or a new product that we're thinking of introducing into the world. What unites all of these different themes, starting with the coffee house and running through all of these different stories, is, I think, a recurring theme about the importance of diversity. The importance of diverse perspectives in those liquid networks. One of the things that made the coffee house culture so interesting is that you had people, yes, they were all white British men, but they were arriving in the coffee house with a whole range of different interests. They were printers and chemists and sailors and insurance business people. They had a wide range, eclectic range of professional expertise. And one of the things that runs through both the innovation research and the decision-making research is that diverse groups are just collectively smarter and more original in their thinking and their problem solving. That diversity can be gender diversity, it can be ethnic diversity, it can be diversity of nationality. Crucially, it can be diversity of kind of intellectual background, professional background. When you put those groups together, they come up with new ideas. And when you think about the range of countries that come together in a forum like this, that in a sense, the kind of global diversity that has been made possible in many ways by the maritime industry and by the shipping business that Lloyd's of London helped bring in the world, that global connectedness that Gillian was talking about at the beginning that we're seeing some reactions against right now, to remind people that that diversity and that connectedness is not just an important quality because we believe in social tolerance or because we want to have equality of opportunity or more seats at the table for different kinds of people, all of which is important as a value. But there's another equally important point that we don't say enough, which is that we want to have diverse groups, we want to have connections between the countries of the world. We want to have global conversations where people with different backgrounds and different forms of expertise can get together and collaborate on ideas, because those groups will be smarter. They will be more creative in their problem solving. They will come up with wiser decisions when thinking about long-term problems, and they'll be more innovative in the products that they unleash on the world. That is what the science tells us. That is what the research tells us. That is what history tells us. That's the opportunity, I think, that you all have with this kind of organization and this kind of conversation and the conversations you're about to have. Chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much. That's it.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for a fabulously thought-provoking set of ideas, which plays very well indeed to what the journey that people have been on yesterday and are going to continue today. I should just mention, by the way, that the High Line, which you put up on the board as an example of thinking outside the box, I found out recently is now the second most visited tourist site in New York. As a sign of what you can do by not taking the either-or choice, but actually trying to think in a creative way. The fate of the High Line is really quite remarkable. I'm going to talk in a moment about where we're going today in terms of the next step of the journey. But before I do, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Stephen? We've got a few moments to take questions if you would like. Yeah.
Fantastic, really very interesting. Thank you very much. Any thoughts on some of the work that Ray Dalio has done in terms of decision making and idea meritocracy and all of that stuff?
Yeah, he has a brand new book that just came out, right? Yeah, which I have not read.
Principles, it's called.
Yeah. So no, I don't have a really formulated thought. But how would you see it connecting to what we were just talking about?
Well, it's, a lot of engagement. It's, you talked about process and,
Yeah.
How process can, drive, innovation, decision-making. Okay, it's not the exclusive, province of, of great decision-making, but he's very big on that in terms of lots of engagement, lots of connectivity. It's his own extreme brand.
Yeah.
Of course.
A lot of it's basically about this idea that you've got to challenge yourself over absolutely everything and have groups essentially having the courage to really challenge what the leader says.
It's one of the fascinating things about groups, which is, on the one hand, they can be the place, again, another, like a conference room, a place where ideas go to die because you have that problem of groupthink. Groupthink is a pejorative for a reason. And so creating group environments where you don't either just immediately coalesce around one agreed position, or defer to the leader, where you're just like, whatever the boss is saying, I'm picking up this signal. So that one of the principles sometimes of diverse group decision making actually is to, sometimes paradoxically, assemble a really interesting group and talk to them separately. And actually have kind of separate conversations with them so that you don't run the risk of the kind of emerging idea that 50% of the group gets excited about actually drowning out all the other ideas. So keeping that possibility of those outsider ideas, keeping those alive is really important to do. And one of the problems is cohesive groups are more fun, right? I mean, a diverse group where people are challenging people's ideas, that they can be divisive and it can be uncomfortable sometimes. So you have to create a culture where people are comfortable with that, but where they understand the ultimate benefits that are going to come from that kind of diversity.
Right, we all like to be with our own tribe, don't we?
Yeah.
Question over here, and then 1, 2, if we got time, and then...
This is a very conservative industry, and one of the threats it now faces from the digital agenda, of course, is the risk of external disruption, and that's something we'll no doubt go on talking about in the rest of the day. Don't get political, but could you talk about Trump and the effectiveness of his disruption? Because it may be too early to judge, but it may well be that, in many sense, there's a positive aspect to the way he makes decisions that is very disruptive, but actually, if you look at what he's doing with China, if you look at what he's done with North Korea, and of course, it's very different from how we've been used to the President of the United States to actually act.
Okay. So don't get political, but
Yeah,
try and
but
talk about Trump.
Look, I think the biggest question about Trump is how much of a one-off he is, to me. Is Trump a unique constellation of forces that happen to come together, most of which actually, if you think about technological forces, are actually older technologies, right? I mean, Trump, obviously, on Twitter it's a part of his persona, but I would argue his Twitter actions have actually hurt him in terms of his support more than it's helped him. And Trump is really a creature of reality television. He's a creature of the New York newspaper tabloids. He's a creature of an older kind of model. The folks who voted for him were largely not on social media. They were watching television and watching Fox News. And so the idea that Trump is this kind of emergent phenomena that is a glimpse of the future in the United States, and that this is actually going to be an active kind of property of at least one of the main political parties, and the way that he's dealing with trade deals is going to be the way that the Republican Party continues from this point on, I think that is still completely up in the air. And it's one of those cases where there is a danger, I think, in Trump is a very significant force in the world right now. There's no question about it. I don't want to underestimate, for good or for bad, what the significance of it right now. But what he means as a long-term historical trend, and what the development of Trumpism right now means for kind of American politics and American geopolitical negotiating in 5 years or 10 years, my gut is that it is less significant than we realize. That there's, inside of the United States, there's some kind of nationalism, protectionism that is a real force, and that has become a bigger presence in the Republican Party for sure. But the style of governance that Trump has brought to the White House, I suspect actually will be a 4-year phenomenon, and then it will be less prominent in the next cycles.
Wow. I must say, my gut personally is that the reaction to Trump is going to end up being as important in the long-term history as the actual Trump phenomenon itself. But that's my own tuppence worth. We have a question over here.
I'm not really sure what my question is, but Uber, Airbnb, such great ideas that came out. In one way, it seemed like it was not following your thing, but in the other sense, it really is very much like what you're talking about. But anyway, just some thoughts on how these two incredible ideas fit into your coffee shop, maybe Starbucks.
Well, it gets to the question of why, there's a fascinating set of studies that have been done over the years of why the Bay Area has been such a driver of innovation. I spent part of the year living in just north of San Francisco, and it's extraordinary. This is not actually that, in terms of population, it's the 6th largest metro area in the United States. But if you just per capita, in terms of innovation, in terms of tech companies, but also cultural innovation. Think of just the things that have come out of the Bay Area in terms of, political movements, social movements, environmental movements, food movements. It's more new ideas per capita formed there than really anywhere else in the United States. So why? Right? Why do Uber and Airbnb and again these companies going back 40 years? Why are they drawn there? And I think one of the things, if you go back and look at the history of Silicon Valley, that relates to what I was talking about, is that it was very much the collision of 3 or 4 distinct cultures that were there in the early days that set a tone. So you had a long military tradition of folks being in the Bay Area because of the Bay. It was because this is the place that the United States thought was going to be invaded, because there was the best harbor on the West Coast. And so you had these huge military presences there. You had the academic institutions that were there, and an engineering culture kind of developed in part because of the presence of the military and the tech scene and the university scene. But crucially, you had the counterculture. You cannot tell the story of the tech sector without talking about the hippies. Jobs was a complete 60s freak, right? He didn't wear shoes for like 5 years. And so that set a tone in that culture, which said both technology is important and radical change is possible in society. And when you put those two things together, that was a cocktail that didn't quite exist in the same kind of configuration anywhere else in the world to the extent that it existed in the Bay Area. And so it was the collision of those worlds that led to that kind of ingrained culture of innovation.
Right. You've clearly touched a chord, because I can see quite a lot of hands waving. Do we have time for 2 more quick questions? Okay. We have a question over there, back there, and then over here. I've got three hands waving. Clearly a lot of interest. And keep your question fairly short, because we'll have to keep moving it to get
My name
those
is
3 in.
Werner Hammerken. I come from Greenland, and we are these days, doing the pre-mortem of the ice cap of Greenland.
Yeah.
So one of the big things we are discussing is the decarbonization of the maritime system. In that sense, coming back to the practical aspect of innovation, now that we look at mission-critical innovation, do you, in your work, look at how important is it to have a physical space, aka the coffee shop, in the idea generation process?
It is important, and what's happened in our time is that the coffee house, actually, we have more coffee houses than ever because of Starbucks, but they aren't quite as generative as they used to be. The new version is the co-working space, right? And there are a lot of interesting developments. There was just an article the other day, somewhere in the Times or the Economist or the FT, that was talking about that was talking about companies deliberately opening up co-working spaces that people in the community who are not employed by the company can come and use, because they want to have those kind of porous borders. So that's really important. But we should not, for all the problems that we've had with the internet in the last couple of years, we should not forget that it remains a great collaborative tool. And I didn't talk about it so much today, but one of my big themes is that really important ideas don't show up as eureka moments and fully realized brainstorms. They're hunches, right? You have a little bit of the idea. And the problem with physical spaces is if you've got part of the idea and the other person who completes that hunch has the other part, you have to be aligned in time and space to have that meeting where they come together. Whereas if you can plant a flag for part of your idea online, and it can sit there for a year or 2 years or 5 years. That's why books are so generative and why the Gutenberg revolution was so important, because someone could have an idea in 1400 and someone could encounter it in 1600 and complete the thought. So I think we have to recognize that there are a lot of things that happen in face-to-face environments that are really powerful, but they also do limit us. And so you want to have a mix of both. That's a cop-out answer, but I think it's important.
Let's take the last two questions together, and that can wrap
Say
up
them
the
at the same
final.
time.
That will test how jet-lagged you really are.
Yeah.
Why don't you ask your question, and then you ask.
So my question relates to how you just mentioned that people who are amateur at forecasting or not as well known outperform people who are established and well known. Specifically, could you tell us how they combine a very eclectic view to do better than someone who's got a monolithic ideology and only applies that?
So why do generalists do better than specialists? And then your question, is that linked, or?
No, it's slightly different.
Right.
Question is, are there good examples of institutions or companies that have institutionalized the principles that you talked about?
Yes. Okay, great. 2 questions. The forecasters that Tett studied, their attitude when they were given these tasks basically to make a prediction about something, and in a sense, they would go off, the super forecasters would go off and be like, oh, this is great. I don't know that much about that particular question, and so this is an opportunity for me to go explore and follow my curiosity and, do some research, figure it out. The other person, the less, accurate forecaster, would just try and steer towards the near, they're like, I have this theory that Russia is about to collapse, and so how can I relate my answer to this forecasting problem to that theory? And they would just try and drive their answer to that big kind of, there's this gravitational pull of this one idea. And so that kind of exploratory mode, and I think this is an important thing. This is one of those places where innovation and predicting are exactly the same. Like having side interests, having, the people I've profiled over the years, one of their shared characteristics is they have a lot of hobbies. Right? They're just like, think about Darwin, right? Darwin had a million different interests on this. He had his beetles, and he had his, his finches and all the different things that he liked to study, and then he kept little, memorabilia about in his office. And some of them were related to his big idea, but some of them weren't, or they didn't seem to be initially. But because he had that open-ended curiosity, he stumbled across things that he wouldn't have otherwise seen because of that. In terms of the organizations, I'll give you one example about the physical space. There's a problem I've seen a lot of times when companies are like, we need to create some of that Silicon Valley energy here. We want it to feel like Google. So we want to create a more playful, creative workspace. And we notice that they have a lot of foosball tables and ping pong tables in those, at the Google campus. So, hey guys, we gave you a foosball table. Go crazy, be creative and innovative and disrupt everything, move fast and break things. And it does. People are like, how that doesn't help, right? So what you want to create, you do want to create a sense of play. You want to create a sense of, the fun of collaborating and generating these ideas. But you have to find something that is actually true to the culture of the company, right? And so my favorite example of this is, people may know, there's a very successful online kind of store, kind of an indie Amazon called Etsy. And Etsy it went public. It's $1 billion company. It's where people who like make handcrafted jewelry and things can sell their goods. It's a single platform for lots of individual artisans making things. And they're based in Brooklyn, where I spend the rest of my time. And I went to their offices, and their thing, instead of a foosball table, their thing is music. And the whole office, the entire office is just filled with musical instruments. They're not in the business of music. They don't sell musical instruments. It's not Spotify. But they recognize that they're a Brooklyn, disruptive tech company, and so by definition, 80% of their employees have a band that they're in on the weekends, And so there's a guitar here, and there's a piano here, and there's a studio where you can go record. And the culture is basically all right, we got this big presentation we're working on. Let's just go jam for 20 minutes and play guitar with each other, and then we'll get in a really good headspace, and then we'll go work on that problem. And it seems to really work because they're true to the culture and not just kind of dropping in a ping pong table and thinking that will change everything.
Well, I like the idea of just going to jam. And in many ways, that captures what the rest of the day is going to be all about with all of you. You're about to go and jam Maritime style. But before we do that, can we say a big round of applause and thank you to Stephen Johnson
Thank
for
you so
a
much.
very inspiring talk.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Lily. Thank you. Thank you very much.